It all started with lasagna. But within minutes, I was experiencing the worst panic attack of my life, unable to escape as my boyfriend pushed me through the window away from my own family. I am Emily, 20 years old, and for a while, I truly believed I had found something gentle in a world that so often felt sharp. My boyfriend, Zach, is 21 and he lived just 20 minutes away from me, close enough to make spontaneous visits feel effortless, close enough that it never felt like we were apart for long. We dated for 5 months, and during that time I often stayed at his place for a few nights at a time. His apartment was small, cluttered in the kind of way that felt lived in rather than careless, and despite the peeling paint and the occasional arguments muffled through the walls, I felt good there. I felt wanted. I felt like I could exhale in a way I hadn't in a long time. Even from the beginning, I knew his family had left scars on him. Emotional ones mostly, though he never went into much detail. I learned quickly to read the way he tensed when his phone lit up with certain names, the way he changed the subject when childhood came up in conversation. There was pain there, the kind that lingers just beneath the surface, and I wanted to believe that just being near him, being steady, might help ease some of it. There was something about Zach that drew me in, something soft he only showed when the lights were off and we were tangled in quiet conversations about anything and everything. I knew he was carrying more than he said. But I also knew I wanted to stay. At least back then I did. His parents would take his phone away like he was a child who hadn't earned the right to speak, not a 21-year-old trying to carve out some piece of independence. They yelled at him constantly, not for mistakes or missteps, but for simply existing in a way they didn't like. Too quiet, too withdrawn, too different from whatever it was they expected him to be. There were days when he would call me late, whispering so they wouldn't hear, telling me he couldn't talk long because they were already suspicious, already accusing him of hiding something. And then there were the times he didn't call at all, only texting me hours later with vague apologies and the kind of silence you learn to read between the lines. Sometimes he would show up with this hollow look in his eyes, and once he admitted that they had hit him again. Not a slap in passing, not a shove, but the kind of violence that leaves a person shrinking into themselves. Zach kept telling them that it was temporary, that he was close to landing an internship and would finally be able to leave. I remember how his voice would change when he talked about that possibility, lower, quieter, as if speaking it too loudly might scare it away. He believed that once he got out, things would get better. He believed in freedom like it was a destination just one more month away. And I held on to that hope with him, because it was all we had in the face of a home that didn't feel like home at all. I tried to please his family not because I felt any warmth from them, but because I wanted to support him, to give him even a few hours of peace under their roof. They were obsessed with appearances, with creating the right picture for anyone watching. Neighbors, extended relatives, people they barely knew. Their home was spotless in a way that felt performative, their smiles tight and hollow when company was present, and their voices syrupy sweet when they wanted to impress. So I played along. I smiled when I was supposed to, nodded politely, laughed at stories that weren't funny, and bit my tongue more times than I could count. I pretended to be the nice, obedient girlfriend, the kind who didn't talk back, didn't question their rules, didn't make Zach more difficult. And somehow it worked. They complimented me in front of him, told him I was good for him, which really meant I didn't disrupt their fragile little world. They liked me not for who I was but because I fit the image they wanted to project. And every time I played that role, I told myself it was worth it. If it gave Zach a break from their screaming, if it made his life a fraction easier, even just for an evening. But pretending always comes with a price, and somewhere along the way I began to feel like I was disappearing behind the version of myself I thought they wanted. One Sunday, I stayed with them longer than usual just for the night because Zach and I had class the next morning and I didn't have a car at the time. A mutual friend had offered to drive us to school, so it made sense to stay over instead of arranging a ride from home. The day passed quietly, mostly uneventful, and his parents were out from morning until well into the evening. For most of the day, the house felt unusually still, and I tried to enjoy that small pocket of calm with Zach, knowing how rare it was to be there without tension pressing against every wall. But then the front door opened after sunset and everything shifted. His parents stumbled in, loud and reeking of alcohol, their voices too high and slurred with the kind of messiness that made me instinctively shrink into the corner of the room. I had never seen them like that before, not openly, not this unfiltered. They weren't angry at first, just chaotic, unpredictable, the kind of drunk that made even simple conversation feel like walking across a minefield. I remember his mother dropping her purse in the hallway and laughing too hard at nothing, and his father standing in the kitchen, swaying while trying to find something in the fridge, muttering under his breath. Zach tensed immediately. I could feel it in his posture, in the way his eyes tracked their every move like he was waiting for something to explode. I sat silently beside him, unsure if I should leave the room or stay still and invisible. It was one of those nights that reminded me how fragile everything around him really was, how much of his world was built on holding his breath and hoping the storm passed without damage. And suddenly the house didn't feel like a home anymore, it felt like a warning. His sister Lily, who had barely said a word to us all day, suddenly stormed into the living room with this dramatic flair, eyes wide and voice high-pitched as she announced to everyone that we had eaten too much lasagna. It was such a small, ridiculous thing, a few extra slices from a tray that was still half full, but she said it like we had committed some unforgivable offense. I didn't even get a chance to respond before her words seemed to ignite something in their father, like a spark finding dry brush. Within seconds he was in the kitchen, his voice booming through the house, screaming Zach's name like he had stolen something instead of just eating dinner. I could hear the cabinets rattling as he slammed a drawer shut, the sharp edge of his tone cutting into the silence that had been so fragile already. He was shouting about respect, about selfishness, about how Zach never contributed, how he was lazy, how he let his little girlfriend take advantage of their hospitality. Zach didn't say much, he never really did when his father got like that, but I saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders curled slightly inward like he was bracing for impact. I sat frozen on the couch, my hands gripping the edge of the cushion because I didn't know what to do. I wanted to stand up, to defend him, to tell them they were being cruel over something so small, but I could feel the tension in the air turning thick and sharp, and all I could do was stay quiet and watch the storm unfold. Zach looked at me with this quiet, defeated expression and whispered that he was sorry, like he had done something wrong by simply letting me be part of his life. He said it was normal, that this kind of outburst was just how things went in his house, like emotional volatility and screaming over lasagna were routine, expected, something I should just learn to live with. Then he turned and went to them, into the kitchen where voices were still raised and his name was still being spat like an accusation, leaving me alone in his room with the door half shut and the light turned off. I sat there in the darkness, my knees pulled up to my chest, and felt the panic rise in a way I hadn't felt in years, like something old and buried had clawed its way back to the surface. The silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, thick with the echo of yelling, the sound of drawers slamming, the faint hum of the television left on in the other room. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my throat, every part of me tense, waiting for another voice to cut through the air or for someone to come up the stairs and turn their anger toward me. It wasn't my home, but the fear that settled over me was deeply familiar. It reminded me of the kind of fear that teaches you to be small, to be quiet, to disappear before someone notices you're in the way. And in that moment in the dark, I realized I wasn't just witnessing Zach's pain, I was being swallowed by it. When I heard the loud bang, a sharp, heavy sound that echoed through the house like something had been thrown or broken, followed by an even louder scream, raw, furious, and filled with something that didn't sound entirely human, I didn't even think. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I jumped off the bed and ran out of the room, my vision already blurred with tears, my heart racing like it was trying to escape my chest. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, that he was being hurt, that the situation had gone too far. I found them in the kitchen, and the sight was worse than anything I had imagined. His father's face was twisted with rage, his fists clenched, his mother standing nearby looking like she was deciding whether to intervene or just let it continue. Zach stood there stiff, staring down, his whole body pulled tight like a wire about to snap. I didn't care anymore about being polite or quiet or staying out of it. I didn't care if they hated me. I was crying, trembling, and I shouted at them without even thinking, "What's wrong with you?" My voice cracked in the middle of it, loud and shaking in that too-still kitchen, and for a second everything paused. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stared at me like I had broken some unspoken rule by speaking at all. But I didn't back down. I couldn't. The fear had turned into something sharper, something protective, and in that moment I realized I wasn't just afraid for Zach. I was furious for him too. His father came at me so fast I barely had time to react, closing the distance between us in seconds, his voice rising to a roar as he shouted directly in my face, the kind of shouting that strips away your sense of space and safety. His breath was hot and bitter, and his eyes were wild with that unfiltered anger people only show when they think they're untouchable. I didn't even process the words he was saying, just the volume, the rage, the heat of it crashing over me. My entire body froze except for my hand, which shot out instinctively in pure self-defense. I pushed him away, not hard, just enough to get his face out of mine, to create even an inch of space between me and whatever that moment was becoming. I was shaking so badly I couldn't breathe properly, every nerve in my body screaming to run, but my feet stayed rooted to the cold floor. It was Zach who pulled us apart, rushing into the space between us with panic in his voice, grabbing his father's arm and pushing him back, his own voice rising now, not angry, just desperate. Everything after that was a blur of raised voices, a clatter of something hitting the floor, and the echo of my heartbeat drowning everything else out. My hands were trembling, my chest tight, and I stood there in the middle of it all, stunned that it had gotten that far, stunned that anyone could yell at a guest in their home like that and still call themselves a parent. And deep inside, something shifted permanently. Whatever illusion I had clung to that maybe things would calm down, maybe things would get better, shattered right there in that kitchen. Everyone was screaming at once, voices overlapping in a chaotic, dissonant roar that made it impossible to think, let alone speak. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the air itself was vibrating with rage and fear, and I stood in the middle of it all, barely able to hold myself upright. My hands were trembling uncontrollably, my knees weak, and every breath felt like I was pulling it through a straw. I kept saying it over and over, not yelling, just repeating it with the last bit of strength I had left. I'll call my dad. My voice cracked, but I said it again, hoping it would be enough to make them stop, to pull them back, to remind them that someone out there would come for me if I said the word. But I didn't call him. I didn't even reach for my phone. I wasn't ready to drag my father into that kind of madness, wasn't sure what would happen if I did. The truth was, I just wanted to intimidate them, to shift the power even slightly in my direction, to make them hesitate. I felt so helpless, so small in that kitchen where violence didn't need fists to feel real. My whole body was trembling, not from the cold, but from panic, from the pure adrenaline flooding my system like a tidal wave. I kept thinking I couldn't breathe, that if I didn't get out soon I would collapse right there on the floor. And through it all, Zach looked at me with wide, terrified eyes like he knew, maybe for the first time, just how dangerous it really was to let someone else inside his world. Zach took me by the hand and led me outside, his grip firm but gentle, like he was trying to ground me even though he was trembling too. The cold air hit my face and brought the first full breath I had taken in what felt like hours, but it wasn't relief, it was a gasp between sobs. He pulled me to the steps and sat beside me, his arm wrapping tightly around my shoulders as if he could shield me from the chaos still echoing inside. He kept repeating soft words into my ear, telling me it wasn't my fault, that what I did was normal, that anyone would have reacted the same way when being screamed at like that. He told me I was brave. He told me I had done nothing wrong. But I couldn't respond. I just cried, not even loudly, just these quiet, shuddering sobs that came from deep in my chest while my body shook uncontrollably. My hands were ice, my legs weak, and I could feel every ounce of adrenaline crashing into the emptiness left behind. I wasn't embarrassed, I was in shock. I leaned into him like he was the only solid thing left because at that moment he was. And then I saw her, his mother, standing in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, just watching us. She didn't say a word. She didn't come out. She didn't ask if I was okay or try to explain or apologize. She just looked at us with this strange, unreadable expression, like she was seeing a scene she had watched too many times to be moved by it anymore. And that silence hurt more than if she'd yelled too. It was the silence of someone who had chosen to look away long ago. Zach turned to her with a voice that was louder than I had ever heard from him, not filled with anger exactly, but with a desperate kind of urgency, the kind that comes when someone finally reaches their breaking point. He said, "Mom, that's enough. Do you see what's wrong with her? This is not normal." His voice cracked at the end, and for a second even she seemed taken aback, like she hadn't expected him to speak up, like she had forgotten her son had a voice at all. But she didn't respond, she just turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind her with a soft finality that felt colder than any slam. Inside, I packed my things as quickly as I could, barely able to focus as my hands moved through the motions. My bag was a mess, clothes half folded, some things left behind, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. I didn't feel safe there, not even with Zach beside me, not even for another minute. We couldn't use the front door. He said they might try to stop us, maybe even take his phone again, maybe say something that would make it worse. So we opened the bedroom window and climbed out quietly, like kids sneaking away in the night. My shoes hit the damp grass and I didn't look back. He helped me over the sill, whispered, "Almost there," and we hurried through the backyard without saying a word, just two figures moving through the dark, trying to outrun something neither of us had the strength to fight anymore. We went to his aunt's house, the one person he said had ever shown him kindness without conditions. And for the first time that night, when she opened the door and pulled us both inside without questions, I felt like I could breathe again. Not because it was over, but because we had gotten away. For now. Everyone at his aunt's house was kind in a way that felt almost unreal after the night we had just come from. their warmth so gentle and effortless that I found myself blinking back fresh tears just from hearing someone ask if I wanted tea. They didn't press for details, didn't make us relive anything unless we wanted to, but slowly, piece by piece, the truth came out and I learned something I hadn't expected, that most of the family already knew. They knew what his mother was like, how she controlled and manipulated and lashed out at the people closest to her, how she wore charm like a mask in public and cruelty like armor behind closed doors. One of his cousins quietly told me, "We stopped going over years ago. It just wasn't worth the aftermath." His aunt nodded in quiet agreement, her expression one of sad familiarity, not shock. There was comfort in that, confirmation that I wasn't overreacting, that I hadn't imagined it, that the horror of that night wasn't something I'd made bigger in my head. And more than that, there was a quiet, unspoken solidarity, the kind that made me feel like I wasn't alone in this anymore. But even with all that understanding, all that kindness, I knew one thing with certainty: I would never set foot in that house again. Not to explain myself, not to forgive, not to pretend. That place had become the physical embodiment of everything I never wanted to be near again. Fear, silence, control. I didn't owe them anything. And leaving meant choosing myself. It meant saying, out loud and without apology, that love is not something you prove by enduring pain. Zach seemed to agree with me at first, nodding quietly when I said I couldn't go back there, holding my hand when I said that house wasn't safe for me, whispering that he understood. For a little while, I believed him. I believed we were on the same page, that the horror of that night had changed something in both of us. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things shifted. He started hinting that it was hard for him to be away from home, that his mom was still his mother, that his father was getting older, that Lily was just a kid who didn't understand. He never said I was wrong, never contradicted the truth of what happened, but he began to shape it like something softer, something more forgivable, as if time would dull it enough for us to forget how it felt to be screamed at, how it felt to climb out a window just to breathe. He would say things like, "It's just complicated," or, "You know how she is," and then trail off, leaving the rest for me to fill in. And what he never seemed to grasp was that I did know how she was. I knew it in my body, in the way my chest tightened whenever we drove past the edge of their neighborhood, in how my palms started sweating just hearing her name. I felt sorry for him, I did. I saw how torn he was, how much he still longed for approval from people who had only ever hurt him. But my sympathy couldn't outweigh my fear, and that fear wasn't some irrational thing. It was real, deep, and rooted in experience. I was scared to death just standing outside their house, even in daylight, even knowing I wasn't going in. My stomach would twist into knots, my breath would catch, and I'd feel like I was back in that kitchen, shaking and silent and small. I couldn't go back. And I couldn't pretend to be okay with someone who wasn't sure if he could stay gone. He didn't realize, maybe didn't want to realize, that what I was going through wasn't just a moment of panic, but a full-blown flashback to a childhood I had worked hard to survive, a childhood where fear lived in the walls and silence was safer than truth. When I stood outside his parents' house and felt my knees lock and my breath disappear, it wasn't about lasagna or yelling or one bad night. It was my past clawing its way into the present, my body remembering what my mind had tried for years to bury. But instead of reaching for me with understanding, Zach dismissed it all like it was a joke. He found a Reddit post I had written, one I had poured my heart into, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to hear from someone who might understand. He read it and laughed. Not nervously, not because he didn't know what to say, but mockingly, like my fear was entertainment, like the words were overdramatic fiction instead of lived pain. He started calling me sensitive, said I was blowing everything out of proportion, said his parents were just loud, not abusive. And then, the worst part, he turned it around. He told me I should apologize to them. That they felt humiliated by what happened. That I escalated the situation. That maybe if I said sorry they'd be willing to talk. I looked at him in disbelief, realizing that the person I had thought was my partner was now asking me to silence myself, to take responsibility for surviving something I never should have been exposed to in the first place. And in that moment, I understood something that had been slowly unraveling in my chest for weeks. Zach wasn't on my side. Not really. Because someone who's on your side doesn't ask you to apologize to the people who broke you. I went back there. Not because I wanted to, not because anything had changed or healed or made sense, but because I had to, logistically, emotionally, something between closure and necessity. I stood in front of that house with my heart in my throat, my hands shaking, and forced myself to take those steps forward, over the weight of everything that had happened, over the fear that still lived in my chest like a second heartbeat. It was the hardest thing I had done in years. And it was also the moment I knew I was done. Because walking through that door again, seeing those faces, Feeling the coldness in the air that no amount of pretend politeness could disguise, it was the final straw. After everything Zach had put me through, his indifference when I needed support, his laziness disguised as helplessness, his manipulation wrapped in sweet words, his complete disregard for my trauma, I finally saw it clearly. He wasn't my safe place. He wasn't my future. He had become just another part of the same cycle I had fought my whole life to escape. And so I did. I got on a plane and went to England for an internship that had been sitting in my inbox, waiting like a door I hadn't dared to open until now. It wasn't just distance, it was freedom. A clean cut from the ache I'd been dragging behind me, from that house, from him, from the twisted idea that love meant enduring. In England, I found air that didn't feel borrowed, mornings that started without dread, and a version of myself that didn't have to apologize for existing. I didn't just leave the house. I left the story. And I'm never going back.